join us today. And I'll now introduce the Levy staff. Director Lisa Pellegrino, Assistant Director Meg McElroy, Mary Gay Broderick, and John Kelly. And before we get started, let's approve the minutes from our July 6th meeting. I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
Okay, moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, it's unanimous. And next we have a time on our agenda where anybody, the public can address us on any topic, of any concern. And I want to see if there's anybody who wishes to speak to us in this 2 or 3 minute time period. Seeing none, we will get going then. This is our first meeting of 2016. And looking back since the levy's beginnings in 2002, and after 2 renewals by city voters, I'm very proud to say that we are currently investing an annual $14.5 million in some 69 proven programs, helping thousands of Portland children and families. In just a moment, we'll hear about the fiscal health and integrity of the levy, as well as some financial projections for the coming years. So we'll start with the presentation by our independent auditor, and that is for the 2014-15 year, Marina Company. Welcome, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Rochelle Friend. I'm a manager at Marine & Company, and I perform the compliance examination for the Portland Children's Levy. I'll briefly go over our findings this year, or our results, I should say. We issued our report this year, February 3rd, 2016, and we issued it with a clean opinion. There was no findings and no recommendations on this report. Our report was based on the compliance requirements as outlined in the ballot measure 26-150, and our opinion is therefore limited just to those compliance requirements. In order to ensure compliance, with the measure, we assessed the adequacy of the levy's internal controls. We tested to ensure that administrative expenses were less than 5% of the cumulative tax revenues. And we tested the administration of the grants and grantee compliance to ensure that all of the expenditures were allowable and that they were within the budgets that were approved. We found through the course of our examination that the controls appear to be adequate and that there is a sound structure for processing these administrative expenses and for the grant reimbursements. We found that total administrative expenses were less than the 5% threshold by $150,760. And we found that all grantees tested reimbursement requests were all allowable and that they were within the budget. Other than that, there were no significant issues or difficulties that arose, and as I stated, it was a very clean audit. So if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to address.
Any questions? That sounds like very good news.
Right.
So we're keeping our administrative expenses below 5% for the children's levy itself.
Correct, yeah.
And our grantees are spending their money as we intended them to spend it.
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this levy reminds us that, as with previous audits, we're always getting great grades for our fiscal practices. And I want to thank the levy staff for doing that, particularly John Kelly, who is now going to bring us some more good news about revenue projections that he has received from our city economists.
Exactly. Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon. Here to talk all good news this year. In January, the city economist, Josh Harwood, every January, he gives us projections for the revenues for the following however many years are left on the levy. He told us this year that the projected revenues for this year that we're in, fiscal year 16 and fiscal year 17, have increased by $3.4 million from what he told us a year ago. So in the intervening year, and that has to do with how property values have changed and what's happened with compression. Those are related things that we're not going to get into too much detail on, but $3.4 million more than we expected. So
For 2 years, for the remaining 2 years? So.
For this year and next year. We're not going to go beyond that because of kind of confidence in those numbers can change drastically if property values change, if economic conditions change. I'll talk a little more about that at the end. But for this year and next year, above what we expected to have, there's $3.4 million more dollars. So needless to say, we have plenty of money to cover our current grant and training commitments. So the decisions you all made in the last 3 years around how to spend the money, those we have plenty of money to cover those. In the past, a few years back, we had to cut some grants because the projections did not come true. At this point, it's looking like we can have good confidence through next year. So we're in the middle, just past the middle of the second year of the 5-year levy, and the commitments you've made have been for 3 years, and it looks like we have plenty of funds to cover those. At the end of next fiscal year, June 30, 2017, we currently project, based on Josh's estimates and our current spending commitments, that we will have $4.9 million in fund balance. So after the 3-year grant cycle that you've decided, if those all, and that's with all of them spending out to budget, which usually there's about a 3% underspending. So there's probably going to, 4.9 million is a conservative number. Of if Josh's predictions or projections are accurate, we expect to have about that much leftover fund balance at that time. So the revenues for the last 2 years of the current levy are projected to rise significantly. So if we look at Josh's number, he's saying the pie is going to get bigger and bigger. However, they're unreliable to an extent because they're based on economic conditions that are uncertain. As I said, in the past, things have changed and the projections have not come to fruition. So we will have greater confidence in fiscal year 18 and fiscal year 19, those last 2 years, a year from now. So January 2017, or a little less than a year from now, because the taxes that are imposed in the fall are based on the property values in January. And so once we get to January, it's like, okay, for the next fiscal year, we can have pretty good confidence in those numbers. Again, a year beyond that, we have less, but it increases each year as we get closer. So that's what I have to say.
So with that fund balance and with whatever additional revenues may or may not be accruing in the final 2 years of the levy, staff is recommending that you all agree to allocate the additional revenues, which would be a combination of the fund balance, and then if Josh's projections show that we are going to have more than what we anticipated, so more than what we would need to cover current commitments, if you will, that we allocate those two together next spring, and that we design some sort of a process to do that in the course of what we would normally be our grant renewal process. So that would give us some time for you all to kind of go through considering options to do that, and you have to also consider obviously administrative burden and the number of grants. There's many different considerations that you might want to take into account, require a little bit of thinking through, and so we think it's probably appropriate to have a bit more process, if you will, around figuring out how we're going to do that, because and many times in renewal it was not typical necessarily to have so much additional funds. That's more unusual, sometimes somewhat more, but not at this scale. So it's just kind of how it goes with compression and how accurate his estimates are and what happens with the economy. And so we would recommend that you all wait till next spring to make the decisions, and that we have a process in the interim to figure out how to go about making renewal decisions along with distributing those funds. So does anyone have questions about kind of where we're coming from on that, or?
So Lisa, will you start like in a couple of months making those recommendations so that we can have them early prior to next spring? So that we'll have enough time to think about it and do some research, and then also see how folks are spending their dollars in their current process.
My goal would be to have either sort of to late summer into the fall to try to be figuring out what process we want to have, because that's half the battle, right, is to figure out what process you want to have, how much process you want to have, et cetera, right, and then come to decisions about that so people are on notice about what the process is going to be. I think that I would probably not want to actually make the allocations until we get that January projection, because that's going to be our best shot. The other factor to consider is that basically at the end of January are when the mid-year reports are due for grants. And so for the grants that were made in 2014, we'll have 2.5 years of data on those grants. And then the ones that were made slightly later, we had some new programs that we did last year when we had additional funding, we'll have 1.5 years of data, which is the most data that we're going to have on performance. And we have things like grant spending, et cetera, et cetera. So we have kind of all of that information to be put together, but it isn't in a state that we can put it together really until probably about, it's February before we get a chance to put all that together. So, and people have enough information to give us. So I think that if we can set the process up, figure out what has to be done, and then you guys can make the decisions when we have better idea how much revenue is likely to be accruing, or at least more confidence anyway, and what the projections are, as well as much data as possible on how existing grants are going. That we can do it as early as we possibly can, given those constraints, but I can't imagine that probably it would be that much before this time next year that you'd be making the actual decisions. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I don't think you were at the last check-in we had, but I asked, what's the alternative? What if we wanted to invest this $3.4 million sooner?
Well, administratively, it's heavier burden, right? Because we have to run 2 processes to figure out how to do it. I think the other thing is we don't have the advantage of much more data to look at in terms of existing grants. And some of the grants that were newly made, we have no data on yet, other than just a quick mid-year report, which is kind of a check-in. So, to me, that doesn't feel advisable, both from a perspective of process, of running multiple processes and multiple sets of meetings to make 2 sets of decisions about monies to allocate. I don't know that it's, we'd have that much to give you to go on at this point, because essentially this is going to allow another year of performance to occur, right, for the grants that we have. And some of them that are newer, that's even more valuable, is to have some performance history. So you're coming in to figure out, well, do I want to renew this grant? And also, do I want to fund it at a higher level for XYZ reasons? In order to be able to see that full picture, you need often a little more time than just, what for some grants has only been 9 months or 8 months.
Are the committee members agreeable to the approach that's being outlined by the staff in terms of timeline? And
I am agreeable. I think what you were perhaps inferring around these dollars is that it's knowing what the needs are in our community. It's very it's hard to sit on some revenue that if we think we could be making a difference now in the community, and yet I also recognize that it's very important to be following a process. Having just heard from the auditor, knowing that we do have good processes that we can again use, but it's helpful to be mindful and really approach it according to the good ways we've done in the past. So I agree that until we have more clarity around how our dollars are currently, the difference they're making, and then certainly, especially for those that, as you say, we have very little data on, it's important to wait.
Annual reports for the grants that we gave the last time around are not even due until the end of July. So it's like we're not, just don't have anything really. Just the very basic check-in information at this stage of the game. And for some programs that are startups, it takes a while to get it sorted out. So, you don't necessarily want to say something's going poorly until you have a little more time to, for people to deal with all the startup issues that occur. So I think it'd be fair to everybody if a little more time goes by to do that. And then you can also have to think about, do you really, how many more grants, if you want to give more grants, how many more do you want to do? Because we did more last time, and so we keep inching up the total number. So I think that's something you need to think about, and you'll be in a position to think about it in terms of everything we have and what you want to continue and how much you want to continue it at, as well as do you want to add anything or not. So
can you give us a little bit of history in terms of when this has occurred before, when there have been additional revenues? How has that been managed?
Different things at different times, because it depends on how much balance is accruing at what moment in time. And also in the beginning, the first levy, the contracts were done differently, so it wasn't the same process. It was a 2-year to start, and then rounds were rolled out over time, and so renewals weren't all at the same time. So that first levy period didn't operate so much like this for a whole sets of reasons of it kind of being startup. Last time we had cuts, and so we were cutting instead of adding at renewal, right? So there wasn't that issue. So it's just like each session, each thing presents different realities. So there's not only one I would say typically we have always considered grants for renewal after whatever period of time. We've always allowed people to essentially ask for renewal, and we've done it in different ways and at slightly different times, just depending on how the grant cycles were running in that levy. But there is always a process around renewal in which we look at what's happening and try to make some understanding of whether we want to continue doing something or not, and what the reasons might be for going one way or the other. And so in one case, when we had additional revenues, we ran, in the first levy period, we ran a separate round for after-school programming because so many people had applied in after-school, and fewer were funded because there was so much competition. So I mean, the different decisions were made at different times. So that's kind of what I mean of coming together and thinking about how do you want to treat it this time and making your decisions with some deliberateness about it.
I think we're all in agreement then with the proposal to take the good news of extra money and extra money above what we projected and add it to our balance for considering renewing grants in spring of 2017, right?
Yeah.
Okay. With the idea of having those additional funds invested by June 30th of 2017.
I mean, ideally before, to Serena's point.
Yeah.
I think as quickly as we can turn the information around to you, we'll do it.
Okay.
I mean, you can see you're just getting our annual report from last year now because we have to crunch all of that data, and it takes a long time to get it all done and corrected and checked and all that business. So it just takes a little more time than it always takes more time than you want.
Okay.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
So are all the new programs that we funded, are they up and running, those who were, so like the childcare, that type of thing? So it's all, okay.
Everything has begun. It's in various stages of begun.
Okay.
So we'll have some, you'll have your first report on them after they complete a year. Basically, that's at the level because then we get real data. We ask people to give us like serious data once a year.
Okay.
So that's what's all in this really lengthy report that we sent to you guys. That kind of information we take.
No, I was
once a
just
year.
interested, especially with all-day kindergarten starting this year too, so I'm just really interested in see what the numbers are looking like. And
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Meg can always give you an update at any moment that you want it because she's over those grants. So if you ever have a question about how a particular grant is going, if it's a new one you're interested in, she's the one, talk to the person who's in charge of that area, and we'd be happy to give you an update about it for whatever information we have at that juncture.
That's a good lead into our next item, which is the annual data presentation by the Children's Levy staff. And this really is something that could be called the Levy's State of the State Report, highlighting the previous year. And I guess we're going to turn it over to Meg and Lisa. Okay.
Well, we'll share if need be, but Meg was going to go through it this year. And we kind of shortened it up this year. We put a lot of information in the long report, so you can kind of look at that if you're interested. And this is going to be relatively high level, and so you kind of see the generalized picture along the metrics that we typically track. And thanks to Meg, she's devised a system in which it was easier to track it this year, so that it was easier to get the information to you than in other years.
Great. Well, Lisa took care of the first slide, so I won't spend much more time on that. The long report that you all have in your folders, though, just to orient you to it, the beginning section of it covers performance by the levy as a whole, so across all of our grantees as a collective set of programs, and then it's further organized by program area. So if there are specific program areas that you're interested in knowing more about, the table of contents will direct you where to find those specific program areas that you might want to delve deeper into. Just to remind you all and to frame performance of the levy and how we're considering it, you adopted overall levy goals in preparation for the grant making that took place in 2014. And the levy goals are here on the slides. They're to prepare children for school, to support their success inside and outside of school, and to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in children's well-being and school success. So the kinds of things that grantees report to us, the kinds of things that we monitor, aggregate, and report out to you are tracked to our goals. You may also recall that in the last grant-making round, you set investment goals to invest at least 30% of the funds in culturally specific services across the levy and 30% of funds in each program area in culturally specific services. In addition, you adopted a goal to increase access to services in East Portland based on information that we crunched this year to look at those kinds of things. 37% of funds were invested in culturally specific services compared to 31.4% on average in the previous levy. So not only did you achieve investing 30% of funds into culturally specific services, but it also increased from the previous 5-year levy. However, there were 2 program areas in which that 30% goal is not yet met, so that will be an area for work in the future, especially as you consider those additional revenues and the renewal process. In terms of increasing access to services in East Portland, in the previous levy period, the 5-year average was 38.1% of children served resided and or attended school in East Portland. This year's figure is up to 45.6%. So your most recent grant making did increase access for children in East Portland. So you did achieve both goals. Any questions on that before I move to the next? All right. There were 9,701 children served in 14-15. That is a slight increase from the previous year. Those numbers are frequently determined by the types of the types of services that are funded, and the number of programs and the number of children that they project to serve. Programs exceeded goals by 14%, which is in a similar range to the previous levy 5-year average. Programs typically exceeded goals in the previous 5-year levy, and the average last time was 15.6%, so 14% this time is not surprising. Those goals can be exceeded because some of the bigger programs that we have to make projections for how many kids are going to serve annually, and sometimes you can't project how many kids are going to turn over in a given slot or drop in at a given time. 32.9% of the, let me go back a little bit. The majority of children served come from families with annual incomes of 185% of the federal poverty level or less. So we look at that threshold because that is up to the income threshold for reduced price lunch in public schools. So a majority of children served are from low-income families. Nearly a third of the children served are from homes where the primary language spoken is a language other than English. So that includes Spanish and Russian and Vietnamese and Chinese and about 40 other languages that are reported as being spoken by families in our programs. And this past year, 69.7% of children served identified as children of color, which is an increase from the previous levy. The 5-year average was 64.4% of children were identified as children of color, so almost a 5 percentage point increase. In terms of the population, there were similar portions of children navigating poverty in the previous levy and similar portions of children speaking languages, from homes in which the primary language is a language other than English. Any questions on those? All right. One of the key metrics for performance that we look at both for the levy and with particular programs is participation in services. So it's one thing to offer the services, it's another thing to make sure that folks are enrolling and engaging over time. One of our first metrics is looking at early exits. So this is whether or not children or families left the program before really receiving much in the way of a benefit of the service or really engaging at all. So 6.6% of participants in levy-funded programs exited early, compared to the previous levy in which the 5-year average was 8.8%, so it's down slightly. 80.2% of all participants in levy-funded programs received the minimum dosage. So it's kind of an awkward term to describe how much service folks should complete in order to be expected to achieve the outcomes that the program is intended to produce. So 80% of participants received minimum dosage, and that's compared to the average, 5-year average of 66.6% in the previous levy. So participation is up. That's a combination of programs paying close attention to it over time, having more accurate tracking methods for looking at participation. And then one thing that we did this year, which was new compared to past years, was that we asked programs to look specifically at that population that had received the minimum dosage in their program and to report out to us the race and ethnicity identity of each participant that had met the minimum dosage, so that we could look at how well is the population that meets the minimum dosage, how well does it compare to the population who enrolled in services. We wanted to understand whether of the population that enrolls in services, are they keeping in the program over time? Or is the program managing to engage them for participation toward outcomes? And what we discovered was that, yes, as you can see in the table on the slide, there is parity for the most part between the population that came in the door and enrolled and who remained in the program over time. There were slight disparities for a couple of population groups. For example, African American and children and families who identified multiracial. There was a reduction between enrollment and participation, but on average, near parity. So we were excited to see that particular finding this year. And because this is the first year we're looking at these data, there's also sort of some caution as to what we should infer about them, because it could look very different over time, and especially as we average out numbers and performance over time. Any questions on that one before I go to the next one? Okay. Outcome goals. So each grantee of the levy has outcomes that they project clients to meet. And this past year, grantees met 79.9% of their outcome goals, which is a decrease over the average from the previous levy. In the previous levy, over 5 years, there was an average of 87.8% of goals met. So the lower percentage of goals met this year is likely due to changes between the portfolio of grantees that were invested in last time and this time. So you have different types of outcomes being tracked. Also, with the number of startup and new programs that we had, there are oftentimes sort of projections that get made about outcome goals that change over time as people learn more about the type of service that they're operating and what seems like a reasonable goal to have projected. So while the number is down this year from past years, this one probably makes more sense to look at over time, because it does kind of ebb and flow. The types of goals specifically measured by grantees include child development and health, parenting practices and family functioning and stability, social emotional competencies and skills for school-age youth, including things that look at positive youth development, such as self-confidence, positive social behaviors, connection to school, and we also look at indicators of school success, such as attendance, academic achievement, disciplinary behavior. And those more specific granular outcomes are particular to program areas. So if you want to look at how programs did collectively on those goals, the program area section of your report is where to find more details on those particular pieces. I should also add that this report will be up on our website after we've now presented it to you. Any questions on outcome goals?
Just one question. Did we have startup grants to startup programs across all of the areas that we grant?
That's a good question. Offhand, I want to say yes.
I think there was more in child abuse than in any other area, I believe, but I believe that there was probably at least one or two new ones in every area. And although they may not, I mean, there's also different ways to think about startup, right? There's programs that are just beginning, might be an evidence-based curriculum that they're just going to start a program to do now in Portland or something like that. Or it can be a case where people are expanding to more sites. We're helping to scale something. And although they're not technically a startup program, scaling often presents some of the same issues. When you go into new places and new locations and to start services, it doesn't always go as planned. And, sometimes things look different than they do after you've been doing it there for a year or two.
It's one thing to think about even in the, as we go forward, the additional time that takes for staff to work, I would imagine, with these organizations. Is that fairly significant?
It can be, depending on the size and scope of the grant and the number of them. For example, like Lisa said, the Child Abuse Prevention Intervention portfolio, there were a number of new grants there, so that is a pretty big lift for staff with those.
And of course, we had the whole hunger relief one, which is entirely new.
Right, that's entirely new, although remember, hunger relief is not tracking outcomes, so it's not going to be relevant to here, because our presumption is the outcome is to decrease hunger, and by providing food, we are decreasing hunger. So we are not measuring another outcome other than that. We're looking at the outputs and understanding, are we reaching and actually touching the people that we're trying to touch? So it's a different set of goals there, but they're not included in this.
Thank you.
All right, another of our performance metrics, staff turnover. So 19.3% of staff supported through the levy turned over during the year. That's within the range that we've had over the last several years, which is 15 to 20%. That varies a little bit by program area. So some program areas have typically had higher on average staff turnover than other program areas. That information is in that program area sections of your report. This in the fiscal year that we're in, 15-16, and going forward to the next year, you all made a decision to do some investing in quality improvement processes to support grantees and training and consultation to grantees around a number of quality improvement areas, most of which we believe will support staff morale, staff skill developments, supervision. So we're hoping to see some decrease in staff turnover over time. Of course, turnover is related to other things, such as their pay scale, and they work in organizations where, and in a sector where pay isn't as high in other places, and there's also typical mobility when you want to move up the ladder into other positions in your agency or another agency just by virtue of trying to get a next step up in your career. So some amount of turnover we anticipate in the types of positions that we fund is sort of a given, but we were pleased to see that there was no dramatic change in turnover this year. It seemed to be in the range that we've seen, but we are trying to make some concerted investments in supporting staff around those issues. Questions on that? All right, and this is our final slide, which is out of all of the data that we collected, kind of trying to analyze and understand what it suggests for areas of improvement going forward. One of the things we tried to do this year was to ask grantees to report in terms of the demographic data of clients served, and specifically the racial and ethnic identity of clients served, to try to understand better for those programs in the past who were reporting serving people who identified as multiracial, to give them a better and more accurate way to self-identify, to understand all of the racial and ethnic identities with which people identify, so we could see better some understanding of what that population of multiracial is composed of. So for example, this year for grantees who were able to report those data, it increased the count of people who identified as Pacific Islander or as Native American, Alaska Native nearly double. So when you take that multiracial category apart to try to understand it better, your population changes in terms of what you understand it to be. In addition, we are asking to have grantees improve their practices with reporting to us on children and adults served that have disabilities, trying to understand better how well Children's Levy grantees are serving that population. We noticed that when grantees reported to us on the populations that they enrolled in their programs, that there was some variation between the race and ethnicity identity of the population that enrolled in the program compared to a relative comparative population. So for example, when we look at the school-age population and the race and ethnicity identity of the school-age population, how proportional is it to who enrolled in our services? And there are some differences there. So we have some, in particular in program areas, so we have some access issues to consider, I think, going forward. Those are detailed also in the program area sections of the report. And then finally, as I said earlier, looking closely at that, continuing to look closely at the disaggregated data by race and ethnicity for participation over time to make sure that those who are accessing our services are remaining enrolled over time. Any questions?
I have a question or comment. First, I'd just like to say I just thought the report was extremely well written and well done, and it was really easy to follow and full of really good information and good stuff.
Thanks, Mitch.
So the one thing I would like to at least talk about adding is it seems like, in a probably a gross simplification, we are meeting or, we're fresh out of the box, but we feel good about reaching more kids of color, those kids that are disproportionately represented, that we're trying to disproportionately get to. Seems like we're doing what we set out to do there, and we are accomplishing what we set out to do to swing investment east of 82nd. So the data supports that. What I would like to see us track is the culturally specific part. So I'd like to see the data broken down in the individual programs that are relevant to how the culturally specific programs are faring compared to all other programs, and culturally specific programs in category versus non-culturally specific programs. I totally get that the data is new and we're not going to jump to any conclusions, but we put an emphasis on that, and I just think we need to track that to see what that shows us.
We can do that. We have those data. I mean, we have the ability to look at those data now. I think one hesitation that I have, for example, speaking for early childhood as a program area, there are some culturally specific providers providing home visiting, for example, and other types of providers providing preschool. So I don't necessarily, depending on the type of service that the agency is funded to provide, comparing them may not tell you a lot in terms of whether one is doing better at something than another. So I think if we're going to compare them, I think we have to be mindful of the types of services that we're looking at and whether it's fair to compare the two types of services together or just to compare, for example, you'd want to look, I think, just at preschool programs in and of themselves or just home visiting programs in and of themselves. So I think that's one thing we'd have to consider in doing it. And so, and then you get it to sort of, go ahead, small sample
Small
sizes.
sample size.
You've got one
That's a big
culturally
problem.
specific provider in that sort of group doing similar things. So can you generalize about culturally specific services overall
Well,
or
you
mainstream
said-
services overall? Either way.
You're jumping ahead to what conclusion we'll draw from it. I'm not
You just
ready
wanna
to draw
look.
any conclusion. I think it's way too early, but I'm just saying from tracking how we're performing, we said this is something we want to do because we think it is more effective than non-culturally specific programs. So at some point in the future, we'll have enough data to see if we were right.
Well,
And-
I would caution you to frame it in that way, because I would say that part of the investment in culturally specific services comes out of really a lot of the public input and request,
Right.
desire for culturally specific services. And I think there is something to be said for providing service in a manner in which people who are consuming the service want it. And so I think, in my mind, what we're doing has as much to do with that than a presumption of better effectiveness, in that I think that anybody who is served in a way and in a manner that is most comfortable for them is going to be a better service for them, or a better experience for them, or has the potential to be. So I would caution jumping to that conclusion that it's automatically more effective. And I think that it's one thing to say to look at data and not draw a conclusion. I think it's almost impossible for people to not draw conclusions immediately and wrongly from looking at data all the time. That is my experience. And so I'm very hesitant to put something out there that it seems to carry an implication one way or the other without, being sure that I want it to carry that implication. So I'd be happy to look at that. I think we need a little more conversation about what that would look like. Because I think at the level where the numbers are big enough to make it feel fair to talk about, you're talking very broadly against many different kinds of services, okay? So you've got an after-school program, and you've got, a child abuse prevention program, and then one serving adults, one serving kids. I mean, you start talking about very different kinds of services, and there's another aspect to it all that, in some cases, people pick reporting pools for us, okay? So that's, they agree to serve this many kids with our money, but they're serving more kids with their total program, for instance, SEI. For us, they serve many more kids than what we are paying for, right? So they're picking a reporting pool of kids on which to report to us what happens. So it's not necessarily representative of every child in their agency. So you get skewing when you pick a reporting pool and if you're doing something about trying to compare effectiveness, you have to start to think about how things are skewed. So that's another caution in there. So there's a lot of technicalities there that would almost make me want to go to like an actual real study conducted by actual statisticians to do that kind of work, because you're really talking about making sure you're pairing things and controlling for variables so you're not misinformed about how you're interpreting cause and effect. Does that make sense? So let's have another conversation about it as we go forward, because I think it's a complicated issue.
Well, I think, I think the point is, err on giving us the data and let us draw our own conclusions, even though you're concerned about.
I'm concerned about the
Conclusions
conclusions
others-
you're going to draw.
Well, and you're concerned about conclusions others may draw beyond this committee, but I think Mitch's point is share as much data as you can and let us, if we draw a wrong conclusion, I'm sure you'll educate us.
Okay. Well, like I said, I'm willing to entertain what you want. We need to talk a little bit further about exactly how you'd like that to look. So let's think it through a little bit more.
I know what you're saying. You can see the numbers, but programs are so different. So even if you look at the early childhood programs, within those programs,
needs to be control for lots of different variables, I think. In order to draw, if you're wanting to draw a conclusion about effectiveness, then you've got to, comparing between and among, then I think you need to be able to control for variables that are really different, that are very different between programs. So you equalize them statistically speaking. And I think that's the tough part about, our data is relatively crude. Okay, so this is the best we can do without like PhD people doing this work and people on the other end who we're granting money to spending a lot more time on collecting data.
If I may, though, it may be possible, for example, to report such information that you would have, and you probably have, on what the minimum dosage, just simply on how, what those look like in programs that are culturally specific and those are not, which, just to let us know. Is that something that is?
We can, but can I walk you through an example of how that will be? We can give it to you, but like the interpretation is then why Lisa and I are sort of hesitant to put that stuff together without probably a piece that would walk through the limitations of how to understand the data. So for example, there were 9,700 kids served by the levy, right? Culturally specific providers are providing, with our funds, very intensive services for children and families. They served, I think, somewhere around 1,800 of those 9,700. So if we were to look at the minimum dosage out of the 1,800, and then for culturally specific providers, for example, and then the other 7,000 served by mainstream providers, you're looking at two different denominators just there alone to draw the conclusion about minimum dosage. So X number of kids out of 1,800 and X number out of 8,000. So it's going to, just by virtue of the numbers themselves and the math, it may not tell you a lot. We can certainly do it, but I think it's those kinds of things where we want to be clear about the numbers we put together and what we can really take from them. Does that make sense? In the same way that we don't necessarily suggest that you look at the early childhood programs and the mentoring programs and decide which has better participation, therefore which is more effective. You know, there's certain comparisons maybe that they don't make sense to make just by virtue of kind of how we've set things up. So I think we're saying we're not opposed to it, but we would just want to be thoughtful and careful about how we put those analyses together and probably identify very clearly the types of questions that you would want answered so we can think about which data might help answer them. Sure.
Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you for this report, and this report will be on our website today, the annual report, and our website is portlandchildrenslevy.org. And now, for our last item of business, we're going to get a website update from Mary Gay Broderick.
Good afternoon. As Dan said, last spring, we decided to embark on a complete overhaul of the website. During the past decade or so, we have tweaked it a little bit, but we went ahead and decided to need a total overhaul. I think the website was literally sinking under its own weight in terms of, it's like a leaking rowboat. Just all the text, the photos, everything that we were trying to put on it. The structure was not built for it. And so much has changed in technology in the past and all these years. So we went ahead and did that, and we interviewed a lot of firms and did a lot of research, and we're really happy with it, and we've got a lot of good feedback. I'm just going to kind of walk you through it quickly. I don't know how often you all look at the website, but so we have our goal really was to make it, give it a whole new fresh look, make it dynamic, appealing, interactive. We wanted to make it compatible with tablets and with cell phones. And that has changed a lot too over the past few years. People are looking at websites on their phones, tablets, and not just sitting at their desk on laptops. So we had to take all that into consideration. Again, we wanted to be a little more intuitive and user-friendly and people be able to find things a little easier. So we have a whole new look, again, all new photos, new color palette, and we have a carousel right here, and we thought it would be better to have like 3 main buckets where people could get their information from. So we've got, these are our audience who are coming to the site. So we've got our grantees coming, grant seekers, especially when we're in funding mode, and then community, partners and providers, people mainly in the community, but also we get people around the state and even from other parts of the country who are wanting to get information on the levy. So you can see that people can get information really quickly, grant forms, the grantees can go right to what they need. We have an events calendar. If you click on here, it goes to, here, I'll start doing some of this, I don't know how fast this, well, here, we'll move up, okay. So you can see we have a map here on the page. It clicks on the agenda, and so we have a new, and then you can also get access all the information along the top as well. We have a new Facebook page that we can go to. You need to work on the connection here a little bit. We started Twitter, so we're tweeting. We have a new YouTube page that we've loaded all the videos on because we have videos now on our site. We'll watch one a little bit later today. We also, sometimes we get calls in the office from people wanting to access 211. So we put it right on the main page that people can click right there and they can go right to 211 and get information. So again, you can get information horizontally this way, or if you scroll down the page, you can get things vertically in the same kind of buckets down here. We started what we're reading page, so combing different websites, getting different articles that might be of interest to people that look at our website. So we're posting different articles from all kind of different media on there. People can access newsletters, or tomorrow will be a recap of the website right here. And we can go to some of the different pages that we have. We might need a little more time for this with our connection. Okay, so we've got, again, just some of the inside pages. On every single page, we've got a stay in touch little feature that people can submit their email to me, and they'll get in our database and on our listserv. So we want to kind of capture them like that. And I have been getting a lot of, a few a week on people who are wanting to get more information. These are some inside pages. We have all the reports on the site that way. This might be of interest here. So we've got all the reports are listed on the side. We also have a new filter for all the reports that you can just type, you can put a report that you want and then put a year, and then the report will apply that, and then the report will pop up on the side. So that's kind of nice. You all fine people are on this allocation committee page. People can, your emails are right down there. This is, we're doing features on, this is kind of a fun page. We're doing features on all of the different program areas. If you go to each of the individual funding areas, I'm working with a videographer, and we've got videos for each section. And at some point, we've got 7 right now. I'm going to do them in phases. It'd be great for at some point to actually have videos for each of our grantees. So I will run one of those right now too. And those have been a lot of fun. And the grantees that we're going out to, we provide them with the video as well, and they're using the videos on their own websites and for their Facebook pages and for marketing what they're doing. So I will go ahead and run. This is a fun one.
Alright, so we're making a thing because apparently the cats are bored. They have to make a cat toy. Yeah, like string all around and then these things for decorations.
after-school programs provide students a safe haven to get homework help, tutoring, and academic support, as well as have fun in hands-on classes ranging from music to art to science. Girls Inc. is one of 69 programs supported by the Portland Children's Levy to prepare children for school, support their success in and out of the classroom, and reduce racial and ethnic disparities in children's well-being and school success.
This program in particular is really amazing for girls because it's a really safe space to try out their ideas. I think a lot of times they have great ideas about how to solve problems on their own, but a lot of time a teacher is telling them how to do it. And in this program, they get to be the ones to say, I think this might work, and then they get to try it out.
We're making a spoon, 3 pipe cleaners, and a rubber band, and tinfoil to make a fly swatter. We're making it a little squid. Our problem was you were baking brownies and you need to get the hot pan out of the oven. So we decided to cover it with tinfoil and some paper plates underneath. So we're trying to make a little gadget that it's 2 feet away that we can't reach. So we're trying to make it a little thing to turn it on and off. You need to get across the hot parking lot where you left your shoes. You have to make shoes like that. Like this, so yeah.
I'm Dan Saltzman. Thank you, Portland, for investing in our kids. With your help, all kids have the opportunity to succeed.
So we've got 7 of those videos, and they're all on the website, and they're on our YouTube page, too. And they've been a lot of fun, and the videographer I'm working with is great, and that's her on the ukulele, too. She played it's her little song. So, again, each page, each grantee area, each funding area has its own page, and we can filter different programs on these pages as well. We've got a featured grant section where I'm featuring all the different grantees with stories. Each of these are stories, and you can go on and click read more, and those will be swapped out every few weeks. Then on the news section, we've got a calendar, we've got press releases, the newsletters, what we're reading, again, all the news items, all the Investa minutes, everything that I'm doing gets loaded on there, and there's a filter on those pages too, so that you can filter by program area, by what you're looking for, and by the program area, and those will filter out as well. So again, it just makes it easier to find things. The search button works, or on our old website it did not work, which is always frustrating on a website. So this one works. And so yeah, again, I think the whole idea of the website is we want to capture people when they get on the site. We want them to spend a little bit of time when they get there. We want our grantees to be able to find things really quickly and easily. And I hope we're succeeding. I've got some, and to that end, we've loaded Google Analytics on the site. So I've got just a couple from some stats to share with you. And this is just from the past month, from February 5th to yesterday. So during that time, we had 545 visits or sessions. Those were our individual periods of time that a visitor came and spent on the site. And that was by 354 users. And 57% of those were new visitors, and 43% were returning visitors. They looked at 2,102 pages, and 1,400 of those were unique page views. So the first number I said, the 2,102, that might include going to the same page a few times on that same visit. But the 1,400 unique page views were individual pages. The main thing they're going to the main page, the About Us, the accountability section. That's where they're going. That's where they're going to mainly right now. The average viewer spent 5 minutes on the site, viewing about 4 pages each. And the bounce rate is 43%. And apparently a bounce rate of 40% is excellent, so we're almost there. And the bounce rate means, the bounce rate is when you leave after just 1 page. So we're capturing a lot of people who are staying and not just leaving after 1 visit. And as far as how they're getting to our site, 82% are using it from their desktop, 15% are using it from their phone, and 3% are using it from a tablet. So that's just kind of fun to track those stats. Another thing that is important to know is that the firm that we used, we selected them from the state minority women in emerging small business list. So they are a certified member of that list. They are a city, they're up in North Portland, they're a city firm, and they've been good to work with. The videographer that I work with and my graphic designer for the past 10 years has also, they're both women-owned businesses. So that's just important to do, and we feel good about that. And that's about it. I just wanted to, show you the site, and hopefully you guys can get on it and tool around it a little bit and tell me what you think. So,
Looks great.
yeah. Any
Great,
questions?
and
or comments?
revitalized.
Yes,
Refreshed. or
all
whatever.
refreshed and renewed and,
Great.
okay,
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Gay.
okay. Yeah, the videos
Check
are,
out the videos, okay.
they are very fun, yeah. Yeah, that is a cute one. They're on our YouTube page too, and you can follow us on Twitter.
Well, at this moment, there's no future allocation committee meetings planned, but as always, when we do plan one, we'll send out the notice to the levy listserv and certainly to all of you as well. And it'll be available on our newly revamped website that we just saw as well. So thank you for being here today, and I wish everybody a happy spring, and we are adjourned. Right on time.